Thanks, Raj, for that very kind introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I don't know about you all, but I'm back on the road again. It's been crazy, but that means that I carry COVID test in my purse, and you do.
We appreciate that.
And I wear a mask on airplanes, and I will continue to do it. People can look at me oddly if they like. But anyway, thank you.
I feel exactly the same way. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. As Raj said, I know you're back on the road in a serious way, so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here. But you really are the best person to kick off this event. We have said this to some of you, but we started planning this even before the war in Ukraine. And of course, now this topic is even more at the forefront and affecting, of course, not only the food system, but so many other aspects of global development, which of course Devex focuses on. So I'm so pleased that you're here. I'd love to start out just broadly. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is having a huge impact on the food system right now. What are you the most concerned about?
That people are admiring the problem, and we are not beginning to talk about the solutions and plan for them, and particularly to plan the financing for those solutions. We have created the targeted momentum that's necessary so that you're seeing articles, you're hearing opinion leaders across the globe from every sector talking about the looming potential for a high food price hunger crisis that could affect availability and affordability of food. Yet the solutions beyond, yes, let's ensure that we have the support for humanitarian organizations, which we must do, WFP, yes, but there's more that we should and must do, because this is not a acute crisis that will end tomorrow. The longer this challenge lasts, and because many of the issues, particularly issues like the high price of fuel, the scarcity and high price of fertilizers, the changing weather patterns, like this is a La Nina year, and so we know that that will have an effect as well. All of those issues are rolling down the track right now, and they started before the conflict. And so we know if the conflict ends tomorrow, we still need to address all those issues. So that's what is.
And what are some things you would like to see happening that aren't currently happening? What do we need to be doing? I think you're right that there is a lot of admiring the problem. Everyone's acknowledged this is an issue, but what should we be doing right now that we're not doing?
Well, my colleagues and I have spent a great deal of time looking at what is necessary. So start at the top. First of all, yes, we must address the humanitarian response. We must address the humanitarian response for the Ukrainian population. We must address the challenges that the humanitarian community, both WFP and all their NGO partners, are facing because of the high price of food and fuel and the need for increased contributions that are required to support the ability for them to provide full benefits, both from a cash as well as a food standpoint, for those who are presently facing acute hunger. But we also know that this is a crisis that is not going to, as I said, end tomorrow. And so we need to ensure that we are pre-positioning the food that is necessary for 6 months from now. We also need to make sure that we are planning for substitutions of commodities that would allow us the opportunity potentially to increase the consumption of the availability and consumption of more indigenous foods. That's not happening. We know that the 500 million smallholder farmers produce 80% of the food in the places where they work and operate. The challenge that the International Fertilizer Association suggests that for every 1% reduction in availability of fertilizer, that's a 30% reduction in the harvest. And so we know that providing access to the inputs that are necessary will ensure we can mitigate the lack of access to fertilizer today. The challenge is that we need to do better than just distributing fertilizer. That's what we always do. We always do to say, let's distribute seeds and tools to support livelihoods. What if all of that work we did last year around the UN Food System Summit where we said we were going to transform it to a more equitable, sustainable, and just food system that operated within planetary boundaries. We use this opportunity to provide the tools to those same farmers that would allow them to have a more sustainable, begin to have a more sustainable agricultural production, that would allow them to begin to invest to support their work in ways that they're using digital tools. What if we could make digital tools available that would support sustainable intensification of fertilizers, that would allow for farmers to share tools in a way and build their capacity in a way that they're moving forward. As Lawrence said in the video, that it's not about building back better, it's about building forward better. And this is an opportunity for us to do just that.
And I think the focus on resilience is really important, because that's effectively what you were alluding to. And, you know, we've had this shock of the food prices because of the war in Ukraine, and that's coming on top of COVID, which is coming on top of climate change, which is coming on top of conflict that was already happening. And, you know, as you said, if you're giving farmers these tools, you can actually be building that resilience instead of every time having an emergency response and doing the same things over and over again and never getting anywhere. So, you know, you obviously, as former WFP chief, were in the role of having to respond to food crises like this. What do you think we learned from past food crises, and what have we perhaps not yet learned that we need to learn?
Well, we can repeat the lessons of 2008 and 9 very well, because they've all been well studied. And we know that implementation of export bans or any kinds of export restrictions will, by net exporting countries, will detrimentally impact availability and affordability for net importing countries, yet we still do it. We now have 17 countries that have some form of export restrictions in place, including the most recent one by Indonesia of palm oil, at a time when we know that the 70% of palm oil, of sunflower oil that's produced by Russia, is unavailable, and that already affecting the essential oil, the price of and availability of essential oils. So that's one. We know that if we do not invest on the front end to support the type of preemptory emergency humanitarian response that I've been describing, it costs us 7 times more on the back end. And it is always more expensive.
It's always the case, but we never learn that lesson.
We never learn that lesson, but we keep repeating it. We talk about it, and I am really hopeful that if we all get behind and start repeating these same words, that hopefully this time it will be different. We know that as I said, I must speak to the humanitarian issues because my heart's always going to be there. We know that we need to ensure that there are humanitarian exemptions when there are restrictions that will allow for the access to food that is necessary. We don't want restrictions, but when there should be humanitarian exemptions for those restrictions. We also know that we must invest, as I've been saying, as Lawrence said, in nutrition, and ensuring that we recognize that this is not just about a food crisis. This is a nutrition crisis, because before this crisis began, 3 billion people could not afford a diverse and nutritious diet. Now, what we've been talking about for the past several weeks is how many people will fall into acute hunger. We have not been focused on the increase in the number of people who will no longer have the ability to afford a diverse diet. That 3 billion number is going to go up. The last lesson that I'd like to talk about is the one that should spur us all to action. There were 40 riots in the response to the 2007-8 food crisis in cities where the working class and young people can no longer afford bread. We're beginning to see that type of instability and community response in places like Peru and Sri Lanka and Iraq already. And so we know that the acute high food prices, when families can no longer feed their children, will result in civil action and population movement.
And I want to talk a little bit more about the financing piece, which is something that you have been working on since the UN Food Systems Summit last year. There was sort of this sense in the community that like, okay, we have this momentum, we know it's a big problem, but we've had these 2 events and attention is on this, and like now it's really time to hit the ground running. And of course, again, we have yet another crisis that we're contending with. So what's your perception of how that's going to affect the funding landscape, and what does that mean for the necessity to really get those dollars?
It all depends on what funders we're talking about. Okay. The challenge is when we talk about funding for investment in food systems transformation, government dollars are limited now. Many of the donor governments are continuing to reel in their own countries from their investments that they made in the national responses to COVID, as well as the increasing contributions that were provided to developing countries to respond to COVID. And those same low and middle income countries that were significantly impacted, both from a health standpoint, were also impacted from a financial standpoint. Their treasuries are empty. And those that rely upon taxes or other trade fees or other fees, those are significantly reduced because of all of the supply chains, the high prices of food, the challenges that these countries are experiencing in their economic return to normality. And then so the question is, where's private sector? And the opportunity for us to appeal to private sector to support the investment that is necessary in food systems transformation is directly related to our ability to continue to build the heuristics that are required to move dollars into market-based enterprises that can support the food systems transformation in developing countries. We know in the energy community, there's been $520 plus billion that has gone into energy related climate businesses. Yes. But in the food system, while we are seeing a year-over-year increase from the private sector in businesses and services, it is nothing compared to what we've seen in the energy sector. We need those dollars.
Why do you think that is? I mean, why is there this disconnect with the food system in particular?
Historically, agriculture and food systems have been deemed as too risky for private sector capital. And as such, the traditional risk lenses that investors, whether VC equity or commercial lenders, use to invest in businesses, the agriculture and food businesses do not meet their thresholds. The good news is that because of climate, because of the potential for blended capital, where we can bring government money together with private sector money to support the capital stack, we are beginning to see capital moving more into this space. We're also seeing more capital move into the space because of the opportunity for new tools like proteins and new digital tools, new biotech tools. The challenge with those investments that have occurred in the food and agriculture space is that they've all come online for affluent consumers and affluent farmers. They have not come online for poor consumers and poor farmers. And so the work that we are trying to perform today is how do we, again, build that capital stack in a way, build that narrative in such a manner that will allow us to track that capital to support the investments that are required to transform the food system.
And where would you say we're at in that effort? Beginning, middle, definitely not the end. How much further is there to go until it's where you really would like to see it?
Well, I would invite you all to join us at the Good Food Financing Network. This is Good Food Financing Network Week. We just held the high-level opening ceremony this morning with the speakers from both the private sector, the government, the UN, as well as the business community of entrepreneurs. And we will hold a series of conversations over the next 3 days to continue to build that narrative that is necessary. But we're in a nascent stage. We're still talking about what we need to do, building partners, increasing relationships. We have not yet achieved the level where the interest has developed into significant dollars. We are seeing some. And Food Systems for the Future, which is the organization that the Impact Investment Fund that I and my colleagues started 2 years ago, we have the Good Food Opportunity Fund that we've launched here in the United States. And knock on wood, we are in final stages of due diligence with our first anchor investors, which will help us invest in Black and brown entrepreneurs in the food space here in the United States. And we have another project with the Minister of Agriculture and Protix and AFIA in Rwanda, where we've begun to receive the grant capital that is necessary to create the first insect protein company that is scalable to operate on the continent. And so slowly but slowly.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot to stay tuned on there.
Stay
Definitely.
tuned.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
And you mentioned smallholders, and I think that's a really important piece of this as well, that often we forget them. We, we're sitting here in Washington, D.C. We can be a little policy centric sometimes, and obviously that is important. But building that resilience for smallholders is ultimately what is going to help us build a more secure food system. Obviously, they're being threatened immensely right now. Tell us a little bit more about what you would like to see done with smallholders and the kind of support that they need. Obviously financial, as you were just talking about, but also, the technical assistance and just the availability of that knowledge and those tools.
When we talk about smallholders, let's keep them in context of the food system. This is where we fall into the trap of agriculture versus consumers and safety nets. We need to talk about this as the food system. And so what smallholders need is everything that you just described: the financing, the technical capacity, the tools. They also need the infrastructure, the markets, the logistics support. We saw this during COVID when systems failed because we could not move food from farm to market because of lack of access to refrigeration and storage. And so you saw produce rotting on trucks that had no refrigeration, and a reduction in the availability and affordability of the produce that was then in the market. And so when we talk about smallholders, let's not stop at the farm gate. Let's ensure that we continue that systems dialogue, and that the investments that are made in the tools that will support the smallholders go all the way to the consumer.
That's something I've really been thinking about since I was in Haiti last October and reported on all of the struggles facing the Haitian food system. And it's everything that you were just talking about when it comes to logistics. It's not only the farmers have no support from any kind of extension services or technical support from the government. That just does not exist, unfortunately, for them. So they're really left to their own devices with adapting to climate change and all of those changes. But then the roads are terrible. There's constantly fuel shortages, gangs are blocking road, the conflict plays into it. And it's just it's one thing after the other, which results in most of the food that Haitians eating being imported, and therefore it's not fresh and it's really expensive. So it's just that the whole supply chain. And I think that is something that we can tend to forget about, is you actually do have to think beyond the farm gate. Yeah. Well, we've got just about 1 more minute. So, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you want to share with our audience that you think they should know as we all think about the response to this global food crisis in this moment that we're in?
Well, first of all, let me thank Devex for this conversation and for convening this dialogue for the balance of the day, and for continuing to report and write about these issues, because the way we make change is through public will. But that's how you drive political change, is when the communities of interest want that change. And not enough people even know that they're facing, that's what they're seeing on their grocery store shelves with the increase in cost of all the food on their shelves, that the gas price, I was listening to my son talk about $5 a gallon gas this weekend. All of that, while it's inconvenient to us and problematic for many here in this country, is life-threatening for people across the globe. And so the answers that we need require that there is a clear information and transparency around the challenges being faced by so many. And so we need you to continue to do what you do. Thank you.
I plan on it. Thank you so much, Ertharin.